Good morning. It's Christmas, or your birthday, whichever is your favorite. I'm about to give you a briefing on some of the new features that we're going to introduce in the Active Directory in Whistler. My name, for those of you who don't know me, is Stuart Kwan. I'm a lead program manager in the Active Directory product unit. I own most of the core infrastructure for Active Directory, and today I'm going to do a presentation that's going to cover most of the technologies that we have in the Active Directory product unit. We basically had three goals moving forward in Whistler. One was to do general engineering improvements. Improvements in the code, performance improvements. You may have seen reports leaked to PC Week about things like prefix bugs or bug bugs. We've attacked many of those in Whistler and done general code cleanup. Our second goal was to address any barriers to deployment that still exist in the product, or at least many of the barriers of deployment that still exist in the product. And we want to try to lower those barriers to deployment. Many of them have to do with scalability, and you'll see that as a theme moving forward in the presentation. Also with managing and monitoring. Last, we wanted to continue to enhance the platform to make Active Directory the best distributed service platform to program to. Of course, as I've said before in previous presentations, no one really wants to buy a directory. People want to buy directory-enabled applications. And that's why it's very important that we continue to enhance the platform as well as make it easier to deploy. The technologies I'm covering today will include the core directory service, the directory service agent, the replication system, the DNS server naming and location mechanisms, the ADSI and LDAP interfaces, and also, to a small extent, the administrative user interfaces, the snap-ins such as user and computers, etc. While you're watching this presentation, see if you can pick out the big ticket items that we're working on. I'm sure that it'll be pretty obvious for you to find those items. Here's a scalability issue which I'm sure that you're all very familiar with. In order to log on to a native mode domain, you have to have a global catalog server available. In a branch office, that means having to replicate the global catalog into that branch office so that you can do a logon if the WAN link is down. Well, we're going to address that. And we're going to address that using a feature that we call No GC Logon. What No GC Logon is a system whereby when a domain controller detects that it's in a site with no global catalog, it goes into a No GC Logon mode. Basically, when a user logs on to a DC that's in No GC Logon mode, it looks up the user's group membership and then caches that group membership. On a subsequent logon, the domain controller will simply refer to the cache instead of looking up the user's group membership again in the global catalog. Now, to prevent the cache from going stale, the domain controller will periodically do a lookup, a refresh, of the group memberships for those users that have logged on to that domain controller so that those memberships don't go stale. Now, if it can't do the periodic refresh, which will be done on the replication schedule basis, if we can't do the refresh after a certain amount of time as specified using a configuration key, the domain controller will regard those lookups as stale, those cached memberships as stale, and it will then require you to find a global catalog server to do a logon. Now, it's important to remember a couple of things about this feature. First, it works best if you have only one domain controller in a given site. If you have more than one domain controller, it's possible for you to log on to either one of them, but only one of them, or maybe both of them, depending if you've hit them both, only one of them may have your group memberships cached. So there's somewhat of an element of chance if there's more than one domain controller in the site. Now, I did a survey late last year, I believe, or maybe it was early this year, asking customers for those remote sites if they believed they would have more than one domain controller, or if they had more than one domain controller in a site, whether or not they would also be able to put a global catalog server there. And the results were about 80% on the side of single DC, and if there's multiple DCs, it would be possible to put a global catalog server into the site. So that's why we use this constraint. Another thing that's important to remember about this feature is it doesn't help those other applications that require the global catalog server for functionality. For example, if you put a Platinum server, an Exchange 2000 server, into a branch office, it's still going to require a global catalog. The No GC Logon feature does not help that particular feature, nor does it help any of the user interfaces, for example, that prefer to use the global catalog server when generating pick lists or as a target of a search. Our second scalability issue, which you're probably familiar with. Say you're bootstrapping those branch offices or those remote sites. You want to put a domain controller down there. You have a very thin pipe that reaches down into that site. Maybe 64K, maybe less than that. It could take a long time to build a large domain controller using DC Promo across that link. Today we're recommending you do things like build the domain controllers in a central location and ship them out, replication via UPS, if you will. Or maybe build a laptop and send the laptop with a technician to each of these sites to use as the source of replication when building those domain controllers. Another problem with scalability, or another issue, if you have an extremely large domain, it can take a long time to build a replica of that domain, even if you're working over a LAN. If you have millions of objects, it could still take 12 hours, 24 hours, maybe even longer for the replication system to transfer that data over a LAN. So what are we doing about that? A new feature that we call Replicate from Media. Replicate from Media allows you to put your domain controller files, put the database onto some other media, carry it to that location, and then in DC Promo, we'll have a separate switch. And it'll ask you when you're creating a replica, do you want to create that replica by replicating over the network, or do you want to pull from an existing set of files that have been placed on this machine? The most popular way for you to transfer those files from machine to machine will be using backup and restore. Basically, if you take a backup of one domain controller and then do a restore to alternate location on the target domain controller, this will place all of the files that are necessary in order to bootstrap that particular domain controller. Now you can transfer the file on a backup tape, the backup file I'm talking about. On a backup tape, you can burn the backup file onto a CD or a DVD, or whatever way you want to do it, and then carry that media around or duplicate that media and send it to as many locations as you wish. There's a bonus with this feature. It also works for global catalog servers. So if you take a backup of a GC, then you'll also be able to automatically create a GC at DC Promo time using this particular feature. Now, it's important to note that connectivity, network connectivity, is still necessary when you use this feature in order to enter the domain controller metadata into the system. So it's not like you can be offline and create a domain controller using this feature. You still have to be online and able to contact a domain controller from the domain you're creating a replica of. A third interesting, not necessarily scalability issue, but I can call it a scalability issue here, is that group membership today replicates, the entire membership replicates as a single unit. Of course, in a multi-master system, this can cause some loss of updates. If I make updates on different replicas simultaneously or within the replication latency of the system, then one of those updates can be lost or will be lost. Another thing that's interesting about this particular behavior of the product is it can be suboptimal in terms of bandwidth usage. You're replicating an entire membership instead of a single delta. Maybe you only added or removed one member from the group. What are we doing about this? Well, in Whistler, we're introducing a feature that the engineers call linked value replication, but I call it replicate group membership deltas instead of replicating the entire group membership. We're going to store replication metadata for each value in the group membership. Now, it's important to note that this only applies to linked value type attributes. It doesn't apply to all multi-valued attributes, so only ones that provide linked references from one object to another. Now, a nice upside of this feature is that it also eliminates the mythical 5,000 group member limit. You can now have group memberships that can be very large. In fact, I've seen early tests that show group memberships with as many members as 500,000, and I'm sure we haven't reached the upper limit on that yet. Now, this particular feature only works between Whistler domain controllers, and there should be asterisk, asterisk, asterisk beside that bullet line on the slide. It's going to mean something for you, and I'll mention what it means exactly later in the presentation. Another one of probably your favorite scalability issues. If you add an attribute to the global catalog partial replica set, then it will cause all global catalog servers to do a full sync. Those of you who are tackling the Exchange 2000 issue right now are familiar with this problem, most likely. If you've been thinking about extending the partial attribute set, you're probably familiar with this issue. What are we doing about it? Simply eliminating the full sync. Instead of doing a full sync, we're going to pull down only the attributes that are necessary. Now, this is only going to work, again, between Whistler domain controllers because of a change made in the replication protocol. Now, the domain controllers are going to do a best effort to select up-level machines, but it's not going to be a perfect system. So there are going to be some constraints on whether or not a global catalog server is going to do a full sync or whether or not it's going to be able to get away with the partial sync. That takes care of a number of the big ticket items we have for Whistler. Another item that we have is, again, you're probably all familiar with the knowledge consistency checker, specifically the inner site topology generator algorithms, are suboptimal in terms of their time usage when you run into situations where you have lots of domains or particularly lots of sites. You've probably all read the knowledge base article that discusses the order of time. It's approximately on the order of the square of the number of sites, time required in order to calculate a topology by the inner site topology generator. So what we're going to do for this in the Whistler time frame is create a tool that has much improved algorithms in it. Now, this tool and the algorithms are not going to be ported directly into the mainline knowledge consistency checker, into the mainline KCC. Instead, we'll provide this tool which you can run on a periodic basis that will generate an inner site topology for you, and then you can import that topology, probably using LDIF. So you'll need to write a batch script and then schedule it to run on a periodic interval that you select to import the connections created by the admin tool and put them into the directory. Moving forward, post-Whistler, we'll incorporate those algorithms directly into the mainline knowledge consistency checker, but we don't have the time and resources to do that for Whistler itself. Oh, I discussed that without actually moving the slide forward. Moving right along. In the DNS and naming area, we're going to do some things to simplify deployment. First of all, domain controller rename, easy, low-hanging fruit. I'm sure some of you have been bitten by this particular, have encountered this particular issue where you cannot rename a domain controller after you've DC promoted it, leaving you your only recourse is to demote the domain controller and then re-promote it. Well, we'll go ahead and we'll do domain controller rename. In the DNS server area, some small features that we're working on. First of all, in the area of bind parity, somehow they got ahead of us again. We're implementing a couple of features. Conditional forwarding, for those of you who aren't familiar with conditional forwarding, go ahead and take a look at the bind manuals or wait for our documentation. Basically, it lets you say only forward if the name has a particular suffix on the end. Also, we're doing stub zone support. Stub zones and conditional forwarding both help you with some of the more exotic DNS topologies that you may have in your network. For a lot of people, these features aren't going to be necessary, but for others, they're absolute showstoppers for the deployment of a DNS server. And then finally, we're going to do minimal support for DNSSEC, aka RFC 2535. Now, if you've ever read RFC 2535, front to back, that is. I know it's quite a daunting protocol to understand. There is a notion in RFC 2535 of basic DNSSEC compliance, and that is what we're shooting for on the DNS server. It means the DNS server itself is not going to be doing any cryptography. However, it will be returning the necessary records, and it will be able to store the necessary records in order to comply with the DNSSEC protocol. Also, we're going to take the WMI provider, which lets you programmatically administer and configure the DNS server, and put it directly into the mainline product. Today, the WMI provider is only available in the resource kit. Finally, something that I'm sure you'll all be interested in, group policy control for all DNS client settings. And this includes things like the DNS suffix search order, which you'll now be able to push down to clients instead of have to visit and configure each client by hand. Also, other parameters such as turning on and off dynamic update for the entire machine using that registry key that's available. Now you'll be able to do that via group policy. In the administrative tool area, and some of these features you may already be aware of from previous presentations, in the users and computers snap-in, we're going to implement welcome to the 2000s, or the zeros as it is, drag and drop. Also, multi-select and edit user objects, very cool feature. And saved queries, which will allow you to create a query, store that query in the UI, and then look at the results of that query again and again and again in the UI without having to re-enter it or deal with using a find or search dialog every time you want to see the result set. In the ACL editor, a number of things that we're doing. Reset permissions to schema default. I believe Prerit Garg discussed this with you yesterday. Also, show effective permissions for a given user or group, something that Prerit also mentioned. And then, when you're looking at the list of permissions on a particular object, being able to tell which parent an inherited permission came from so that it's easier to walk back up the tree and do ACL debugging. Also in the admin tool area, an improved object picker with much better scalability. Instead of having a navigation or browsing metaphor, it's much more of a search metaphor. What we found when we were working with administrators and talking about Whistler features, moving forward with the object picker, a lot of people know some hint about the thing that they're looking for in the object picker. Maybe they know part of the name or some characteristic of the object. So a search metaphor is much more efficient than a browsing metaphor. In the management and monitoring area also, we're looking at replication monitoring through a WMI provider. This WMI provider is going to plug into the HealthMon framework and give you a very basic thumbs up, thumbs down look at replication on a per server basis. So you'll be able to insert a number of servers and then basically see the Christmas tree, red light, green light, on those servers. We'll also be doing some trust monitoring work, building the underpinnings, building the WMI provider to do that, and then providing probably some web pages or ASPs, scripts, which then let you look into the WMI provider and view trust and the status of trust on a number of domains and domain controllers. Now, moving forward to enhance the platform, and this will probably be less interesting for this particular audience, unless there are some developers out there, but you can see some of the benefits of these features. One of the things that the directory today is very inappropriate for is highly volatile data, data that changes rapidly. If you have data that changes rapidly and you put it into the directory, either it replicates to all of the domain controllers for a given domain, or it doesn't replicate at all if the attribute is marked as non-replicated. And this can make it tricky for an application developer to be able to select between which of these options, rock, hard place, not really sure what to do. If you have a lot of replicas, it can mean that the data, even though it's rapidly changing, may take a long time to reach some of the replicas. And also, the data may be going places where you really don't want it to go, or you really don't care for it to go, because you simply had to put a domain controller there for some other reason. So one of the features that we're working on and building for Whistler is a feature that we call the non-domain naming context, or NDNC. What the NDNC is a naming context that you can place or you can create on any domain controller in a forest. And then you can create replicas of that naming context on any other domain controller or set of domain controllers in the forest that you want. That way you can very carefully restrict the locations that the data replicates to. Now there's some constraints on the NDNC. First of all, it cannot host security principals. It's not a domain. It doesn't have SAM watching over it to manage security principles. It's just a plain naming context, more along the vein of the configuration NC or the schema NC to a lesser extent. It will observe the schedule, the intersite schedule, like any other name NC on the system. So you can imagine how the NDNC could be cool. Think, for example, if you're running Active Directory Integrated DNS, what Active Directory Integrated DNS does to you today. If you install DNS on a number of domain controllers and then directory integrate a zone, that zone goes to domain controllers that aren't running DNS as well. In the future, now we're not going to be able to get this in the Whistler timeframe, but in the future, we'll look to changing the DNS server to use the NDNC. That way you can be very precise about where a zone replicates. And not only that, it won't be constrained to the domain NC anymore. You'll be able to send an Active Directory integrated zone across the domain boundaries and to any DNS server running on a domain controller anywhere in the forest. In the LDAP and ADSI areas, we're implementing virtual list views and or AKA cursoring. There's no RFC yet for this particular protocol, but it's very close in the IETF, which lets you page through a set of results. Today you can page forward through a set of results in the LDAP protocol by using page results, but you can't page backwards. So if you have a list of 1 million objects, you end up bringing all of those objects into memory and having to remember them all. Using this VLV technique, you can window through a result set. We're also fixing our aux class support. Windows 2000 Active Directory does not implement aux class per the X501 specification. So specifically, X501 says that you can associate an aux class with a particular instance of an object instead of associating it with the schema definition of an object. So we're fixing that support for Whistler. And it's necessary mainly for interoperability. We found some applications that expect to be able to do the aux class feature the way that it's specified in X501. We're also implementing dynamic entries. You can read a little more about dynamic entries in RFC 2589. Basically, an object is assigned a time to live, and when the time to live runs out, if it hasn't been refreshed, the object is deleted. It disappears. This is interesting for a variety of new applications moving forward. Also, we're bringing the ADSI and the WMI programming worlds closer together, trying to unify the programming model. And the first step here is what we call the UMI path, or a single path able to address a given ADSI or WMI object. Now, remember when I was talking about linked valued replication, or LVR, aka replication of deltas of group membership rather than entire group membership? Remember how I said that was only possible between Whistler domain controllers? Well, we have to actually enforce that. If you only installed a few Whistler domain controllers in a forest, then you may lose data, or you would lose data if you did linked valued replication between some domain controllers, but then whole attribute replication between other domain controllers. So we have to enforce that all of the domain controllers that are going to be involved in a particular LVR replication are running Whistler before we're allowed to turn on LVR replication. And the way that we do that is a feature that we call Active Directory Behavior Versioning. And you can think of this as native mode on steroids, or native mode on hormones, or a generalized native mode mechanism. we're going to generalize native mode. So moving forward, we can introduce these features that have no backward compatible counterpart. Think, for example, a very easy way to think of this is group nesting. You couldn't do group nesting in Windows 2000 until you were in native mode, because if you tried to replicate nested groups to an older domain controller, an NT4 domain controller, then it wouldn't understand how to represent that data or handle it. Same thing is true as we're moving forward with things like linked valued replication, because we're changing the way group membership is stored. The Windows 2000 domain controllers don't know how that representation works, or how to store that particular representation. So we're going to introduce two new variations of native mode, and we call those the domain version and the forest version. Certain features will only become available if a domain version is advanced to a particular version number, and the same is true for a forest. So for the domain version to advance, for example, to the Whistler version, you'll need to upgrade all of the domain controllers in the domain to Whistler, and then also throw the switch. Exactly the same thing as you did for native mode in Windows 2000. For the forest behavior version, you'll have to upgrade all of the domain controllers in the forest to Whistler before you'll be able to advance to the Whistler forest version. Again, similar to native mode, there's no going back. Version numbers can only increase. And we're putting the interlocks in the system necessary to make sure that that never happens. So don't even think about trying to do an authoritative restore on these particular attributes. So what does this mean for Whistler? We've identified two features so far. This list may not be exhaustive at this point. Two features that we're going to require Whistler mode. In the forest, linked valued replication, or the group membership replication improvements, is going to require Whistler native mode in the forest. You'll have to upgrade all of the domain controllers. And the reason why we need to enforce this and can't enforce it within a domain only is group membership, particularly universal group membership, is replicated between domain controllers in different domains through the global catalog. So we need to preserve the format, and we need to do that between domains as well as within a given domain. For domain version, we've only identified one feature, Active Directory integrated stub zones. Remember how I mentioned we're allowing stub zones, or allow the creation of stub zones on our DNS server in Whistler. You'll need to be at Whistler domain mode if you want to use an Active Directory integrated stub zone. And this is me being very upfront with you. These are the features that we're not doing in Whistler and that we will continue to look at moving forward. No domain rename, no move domain between forests, schema delete, schema per domain, multiple domains per domain controller, read-only naming contexts, inter-domain policy and ACL propagation, inter-domain SMTP replication, and per OU password policy are items we're not going to be able to get to in the Whistler timeframe. With that, I'd like to open the floor up to questions and address any other issues you'd like to talk about.
Two questions right now, Stuart.
Two questions. From Andrew Ferguson, I have a message. Would this allow for DNS or other NDNCs? This is an NDNC question. Would this allow for NDNCs across multiple enterprises, so across multiple forests? No, NDNCs will only replicate within a given forest. You can't replicate them between forests. That would be hard. And I've got your feedback, and we'll take that moving forward. Another question from Andrew Ferguson. Is there a limit on the number of NDNCs that you can define? I do not believe there is a limit. It will be limited to the available resources on the machine, disk space and memory probably. We're providing, by the way, for NDNCs a programmatic method by which you can create them. So, and also, there'll be at least a command line tool that will allow you to create NDNCs if, for example, you create an in-house application that's going to use NDNCs. Another thing that's cool about NDNCs is they're located using exactly the same mechanism as domains are located, using DNS. So NDNCs have DNS names. And the dsgetDC name API can be used to locate which domain controller an NDNC is running on. Question from Dave at Compaq, I believe. Are there any plans for a tool that would produce a graphical representation of the entire forest replication topology? We're definitely looking at that, but we have no scheduled plans for Whistler. There are actually a variety of opportunities that we have in this area. You may put 2 and 2 together on our acquisition of Visio, and perhaps our use of the Visio canvas. Maybe moving forward, but not in the Whistler timeframe. Oh, I think I missed another question from Dave at Compaq. Again, same question. Any plans for a cross-forest NDNC? And the answer is we hadn't considered that, but we will consider that moving forward. Are these other questions, John, also ones that I should be going? No? That is it. Okay. Again, if you have questions about things that we're doing in Whistler, hit me now. I've always wanted to do television. I've done radio before. Those of you who have heard me on the Premier Expert Roundtable calls. I prefer a live audience, frankly. However, this is also very interesting. Well, if I don't have any other questions, I'd like to wrap up. Thank you very much for listening to this presentation on new features for Active Directory in Whistler. And I hope you're rubbing your hands in anticipation for first builds of this product the same way that I am. Thank you very much, and have a good weekend.